For the members on the call, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you.
Great, thank you.
Do you want to mute yourself again?
Hmm?
Do you want to mute yourself again?
1. This hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's fiscal year 2022 budget. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. We're holding this hybrid hearing in compliance with the regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 965, carried over to the 117th Congress via House Resolution 8. Members and witnesses may participate remotely or in person. I would like to remind members that we have established an email box for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to your staff. For individuals who are participating remotely, consistent with regulations, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute a participant's microphone when the participant is not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members participating remotely are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. Members participating remotely must have their cameras on and be visible on screen in order to be recognized. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. Finally, in light of the attending physician's new guidance, individuals physically present in the hearing room who are fully vaccinated do not need to wear a mask or socially distance, though they may choose to do so. Individuals who are not fully vaccinated must continue to wear a mask unless they are speaking under recognition and must continue to socially distance. Now I will introduce our witness. This morning we will be hearing from the Honorable Marcia Fudge, Secretary, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. I'd like to start by welcoming our former colleague back to the House, the distinguished gentlewoman from Ohio, Secretary Marcia Fudge. Congratulations on your confirmation and thank you for being with us in person today. Madam Secretary, as you well know, having a place to call home is the bedrock of success. It's not just where you lay your head at night and where you start your day. It's where you start your family and begin to plan for the rest of your life. Ensuring that every American has access to decent housing, to homes that are stable, secure, sanitary, and safe, should be a national priority. Instead, it has become a national failure. Millions of struggling Americans are currently living in dilapidated, outdated, and unsafe homes, and nearly 600,000 Americans experience homelessness on any given night in our country. More than a generation ago, our government invested in safeguards to ensure housing affordability, including public housing. Now, 50% of public housing in America is more than 50 years old. And even with these units, waiting lists are tragically long and families are turned away. The unmet needs go beyond public housing. Even before the pandemic, rent increases were outpacing renters' real income. In the last 2 decades, renters have seen their income rise less than 4%, while their rent rose at least 15%. Today, 11 million families pay more than half their income on rent. If you add in rising housing costs, it is not difficult to see how the idea of working hard enough to one day buy a home has become more of a pipe dream than the American dream. Without federal investments to restore safeguards and address systemic failures, this crisis will only get worse. That is why President Biden's 2022 budget includes historic investments in America's housing infrastructure to build and modernize housing across the country, increase sustainability and affordability, and expand opportunities for lower-income families and in previously excluded communities. The low-income housing tax credit is one of the federal government's most powerful tools for building and rehabilitating affordable housing, producing an estimated 100,000 affordable rental units per year. The President's budget invests an additional $55 billion in this proven initiative and pairs it with investments in other successful housing subsidy programs. This includes a $40 billion increase for the Public Housing Fund to build, maintain, and retrofit more than 1 million affordable rental housing units across the country. Increased capacity must also come with a commitment to increased accessibility, sustainability, and safety. That's why the President's budget provides resources to support and sustain homeownership and renting opportunities, to upgrade and build schools and childcare facilities, restore vacant buildings, and reverse the effects of disinvestment in our communities. It makes investments to remove lead-based paint and address residents' critical health and safety concerns. It also includes incentives for zoning reform to remove exclusionary zoning laws and harmful policies that have not only inflated housing costs, but have also segregated communities and often barred low-income families and families of color from high-opportunity neighborhoods. It prioritizes the housing needs of communities that have been historically left behind or ignored, like Indian country and rural America, as well as our veterans. These resources will not only transform cities and communities, they will transform lives and fuel our recovery by creating hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs across the country. I've seen it work firsthand. My hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, is a national model of the power of federal housing investment. We are home to 4 highly successful Hope 6 projects. And just 2 weeks ago, we held a grand opening for a 5th project, this one funded through the newer Choice Neighborhood Program. I can't overstate the impact of these federal investments. Entire neighborhoods transformed, entire families set up for success, and new areas of economic growth for our entire city. That is what can happen when the federal government invests in affordable housing. Yes, the American Rescue Plan provided emergency rental and homelessness assistance as at-risk families struggle to keep a roof over their head during the pandemic. And while this critical support continues to save households from eviction, ending the pandemic will not end our nation's housing crisis. That is why we need the historic investments and comprehensive plans outlined in the President's budget. Secretary Fudge, I look forward to hearing more about this today, and I thank you again for being here. With that, I'd like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Smith, 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary Fudge. It's great to have you with us, first cabinet secretary, and so it's nice to have a former colleague. The President's budget is a massive spending and tax plan, $17 trillion in new debt over the next 10 years. It taxes Americans to the tune of $55 trillion. The President breaks his promise not to raise taxes on American families who make less than $400,000. Under this budget, in 10 years, America will pay more to settle the interest on our national debt than it costs today to take care of our seniors on Medicare. It will also cost more than our entire national defense budget, and 15 times more than the HUD budget. But it's not just this explosion in federal spending and debt that concerns America's working class. It is the increased command and control over their lives and livelihoods by Washington Democrats, people who have never appeared on a single ballot, but which the Biden administration wants to give undue influence over some of the most personal decisions in our lives, like where and how we choose to live. Already we are seeing the effects of the President's policies, the high prices Americans are facing at the pump and in the checkout line due to rising inflation. For your department, Madam Secretary, the Biden administration has requested more than $68 billion. Over the last 6 months, Congress already provided $46 billion in rental assistance funding, which is more than 70% of your department's annual budget. And yet the administration cannot show how much of that money was actually used to repay rent during the pandemic. This is a startling lack of accountability for such an immense sum of money. The budget gives HUD a 15% raise. I would note at the same time, it flatlines Homeland Security funding during a crisis at our southern border. Since January, we've had over 700,000 migrants attempt to illegally enter the United States, more than the number of people in the entire state of Wyoming or Vermont. America is a generous nation, but we must ensure that public resources go to Americans in need before illegal immigrants. That is why it's alarming to hear that HUD is not requiring applicants to provide Social Security numbers for emergency housing vouchers. With thousands of homeless veterans struggling for help in our country, it's unacceptable to think that this administration would put illegal immigrants over the men and women who served our country. Congress has some work to do as well. Right now, almost every program at HUD is operating under long expired congressional authorizations. Democrats have been in the majority for over 900 days, and during that time, Congress has failed to reauthorize a single program at HUD. In fact, the Financial Services Committee has conducted 17 full hearings this Congress, and none of them have addressed reauthorizing any of these programs. We cannot identify waste, fraud, and abuse in our federal programs if Congress fails to do its most basic job. These failures also contribute to making the web of programs that HUD administers more complex and costly over time. After reading this budget, one thing is clear. President Biden is not focused on the concerns of the working class, even when it comes to housing policy, while gas and food prices are going up as a result of the president's policies. This budget has an $800 million subsidy for Green New Deal projects. The working class cannot afford to wait while President Biden puts solar panels on their houses. The cost of living is going up right now. They want a budget that helps them support their families, drives up wages, and restores economic security. I'm sorry to say this budget for HUD falls short for the American people. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for your opening statement. In the interest of time, I ask that any other members who wish to make a statement submit their written statements for the record to the email inbox we established for receiving documents before and during committee proceedings. We have distributed that email address to your staff. I will hold the record open until the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. Once again, I'd like to thank Secretary Fudge for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks, and you may begin when you are ready.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and the distinguished members of this committee. Certainly, I miss being here with you, but I have other work to do. So thank you so much for having me here today. I just want to say that the Biden-Harris administration has put forth transformational investments, which the public very much support. Even before the onset of COVID-19, nearly 11 million families spent more than half of their incomes on rent. The pandemic has only made that situation worse, especially for communities of color and people of modest means. The president understands we must take bold action to address America's affordable housing crisis. That is why President Biden has proposed a budget for fiscal year 2022 that requests $68.7 billion on behalf of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This amount represents an increase of $9 billion, or 15%, from HUD's enacted funding level for fiscal year 2021. The president's budget would greatly strengthen the social safety net for the most vulnerable among us. It contains $3.5 billion to provide housing and supportive services to Americans experiencing homelessness, including young people and survivors of domestic violence. The president's budget requests $30.4 billion for HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Program. And if enacted, it would deliver potentially life-changing assistance to an additional 200,000 households. The president's budget takes strong steps to preserve America's public housing stock. Nearly half of our public housing is more than 50 years old. Many properties face major capital needs. This is not just a safety issue, but an issue of racial justice, as people of color represent more than 70% of Americans who live in public housing. That is why President Biden's budget invests $3.2 billion toward public housing capital funds to help dramatically improve the quality of life of those residents. And to further advance equity for underserved communities, the president's budget requests $723 million in Indian housing block grants. This funding would help create affordable housing, improve water conservation, and build climate-resilient infrastructure on tribal lands. In addition, the president's budget contains major investments to strengthen HUD's capacity to serve the American people. Between 2012 and 2019, the number of full-time employees at our agency declined by roughly 20%. HUD's dedicated team of outstanding civil servants is overworked and understaffed, and they need help. The president's budget would provide $1.7 billion for HUD's internal operations. This would allow our department to hire the employees we need to deliver critical services, from disaster relief to fair housing enforcement with urgency and with efficiency. To build upon the vital funding contained in this budget and to dramatically expand our supply of affordable housing, the President has proposed the American Jobs Plan. It represents a once-in-a-generation investment in our nation's infrastructure, including our housing infrastructure. All told, the Jobs Plan provides $318 billion to construct, restore, and modernize more than 2 million affordable places to live. It would significantly expand HUD's Housing Trust Fund, which helps create homes for renters with limited incomes. It would help produce as many as 600,000 affordable homes by increasing support for initiatives such as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. In addition, the Jobs Plan includes a new tax credit based on the proposed Neighborhood Homes Investment Act that can help build and renovate 500,000 homes for buyers of more modest means. Taken together, the investments found in the American Jobs Plan and the President's budget underscore this administration's commitment to address our affordable housing crisis head-on. The American Jobs Plan and the President's 2022 budget tell the American people we view housing as a foundational platform to help solve our most urgent challenges, to expand security for those who live on the outskirts of hope, to advance opportunity and equity on behalf of marginalized communities, and to help provide every person with a dignified place to call home. As a member of Congress for nearly 13 years, I have the highest regard for this institution and thank each of you for the work you do on behalf of the American people. I look forward to working with this committee to ensure HUD acts as a responsible steward of the funding entrusted to our department and to help make housing for all a reality in America. And with that, I am happy to answer your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for that statement. We'll now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and responses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them to the clerk electronically within 7 days. And now I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for being here. Just for context, the United States spent $6.5 trillion in 3 wars in the Middle East. None of it was paid for, and there was no economic growth that came to the American economy because of that so-called investment. But we did pay a price. 7,036 United States soldiers were killed in those wars in Iraq. Today, the Taliban is growing their influence. In Afghanistan, 20 years ago, we took the Taliban out after 9/11. Iran and the Shia militias own Iraq today. So the reason why this is relevant is for context and the contrast between what the president's budget offers in the renewal of America as a powerful force for good in urban and city renewal. You represented Ohio's 11th district proudly for many, many years. I represent Buffalo and Western New York. This pandemic exposed a lot of the fragility, the vulnerability of the American economy and American society, particularly for people of color. And this bill, your budget, $68.7 billion, a $9 billion increase, is what we need. The Neighborhood Homes Investment Act is a 35% tax credit for the construction and renovation of over 500,000 homes in this country over the next 5 years. Too many times in Washington, we are confronted with a false choice. People will make the distinction between Wall Street and Main Street. What this bill does, it addresses the thing that's been forgotten for the past 50 years, and that's the neighborhood streets, where the homes are, where people live and struggle every single day. So I just want you to continue to advocate for your budget and commit to helping me rebuild my community of Buffalo and Western New York and Niagara Falls, much like you were committed to Ohio's 11th district and the many, many years that you served there.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Higgins. And let me just say that the thing that is so outstanding about this budget and the jobs plan is that finally, as a nation, we are investing in people. We invest in many, many things. We invest in brick and mortar. But today and going forward, we are investing in America's people. The ranking member talked about working class people. I come from a working class family. I talk to working class people every day, and they are finally feeling some hope about what we, the people who represent them every day, me at HUD and you here, will do to change their lives. And so I thank you, sir, and you have my commitment that I will work with you in any way I possibly can.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, I will start with an issue back home in Missouri with College of the Ozarks, disputing a recent HUD directive which would force schools to violate their religious beliefs by obligating them to open their dorm rooms and shower spaces to members of the opposite sex. The directive, based on President Biden's reinterpretation of the word sex in an executive order signed in January, requires entities subjected to the Fair Housing Act not to discriminate based on gender identity. As such, and since dorms are considered multifamily housing under HUD's purview, HUD could bring enforcement actions against faith-based colleges like the College of the Ozarks in Branson. Madam Secretary, do you believe the College of the Ozarks dorm and bathroom policies, based on strongly held religious beliefs, place them in violation of HUD's directive?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Ranking Member. What I do believe is that it is the law. The Bostock rule from the Supreme Court says it is the law, and I am sworn to uphold the law.
So you're also sworn to uphold the Constitution of free speech?
Correct.
And so can you commit to me here today that HUD will not violate the First Amendment rights of faith-based private institutions by enforcing this directive?
What I will commit to you, sir, is that we will not violate anyone's constitutional rights.
That's good to hear, Madam Secretary. So it looks like College of the Ozarks is good. As I'm sure you are aware, over 700,000 migrants have illegally crossed our border since January, more people than the entire population of Kansas City, Missouri. However, despite talk from the White House, there has been little action to address the overwhelming border crisis. In fact, some would argue the president and vice president have in fact encouraged it. Your department recently put out guidance describing the process to allocate emergency housing vouchers. It disturbed me to read that despite federal law stating the contrary, the Biden administration reversed prior guidance and is no longer requiring applicants to provide Social Security numbers in order to assess these vouchers and taxpayer dollars. In fact, on June 11th, 4 U.S. senators sent you a letter calling on you to reverse this policy. I ask unanimous consent to submit this letter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've basically rolled out the welcome mat to 700,000 illegal immigrants looking for a taxpayer funding place to stay. First off, can you confirm that this is true?
No, I cannot.
So you did not have a directive that you no longer have to use Social Security numbers to apply?
No, what it says is that we have time to do it. What we are doing, sir, so that it is characterized properly, is when we find homeless people, we do give them vouchers, but we then do check. So it's not that we are not checking.
And how long does it take for you to check if they have a valid Social Security number?
We work with our partners on the ground. I don't know the date, but I can tell you how long it'll take, and I'll get back to you with that answer.
And can you also explain what HUD is doing to make sure we're prioritizing American citizens and not illegal immigrants, and ensure American citizens are the first to receive the assistance for these federal government vouchers?
Well, first off, only American citizens technically, or those who are here legally, can receive it. And
So there's no illegals that's receiving any vouchers?
as far as I know, they are not.
That's great news, and I would love to see if there's anyone that would argue that. On the other hand, there are over 37,000 homeless veterans in the United States. And nearly 500 in my home state of Missouri. Yet your budget zeroes out a program specifically designed to help homeless veterans. Can you please explain the reasoning for zeroing out this program in your budget while asking for more money for virtually every other program?
We already have resources between us and VA. We have those resources for homeless veterans. And those numbers, quite frankly, up until COVID, were going down, not up. And so we have a focus, a very definitive focus on getting veterans off the street. And I think that you will find, if you look at this budget, the president's budget, and the VA budget, you will see that those resources are there.
So, Madam Secretary, based on your response to that question, and since the funding for homeless veterans was zeroed out, that wasn't an increase, it was zeroed out, and you said that there was already resources for that, your budget under the bailout bills have received an incredible amount of money. Are you saying all of those had zero money left over?
No, what I'm saying to you is that between HUD's, the 200,000 vouchers that you've already that we've talked about from the jobs plan, the resources that you've given us, graciously given us, from the COVID package in December and the rescue package in March, do account for vouchers for veterans.
And you just zeroed it out, didn't need any more additional dollars for veterans?
We zeroed it out in our budget. but
Okay.
what I'm saying to
That's
you, sir, is that the resources are there in the VA. We work together. It's
Yeah,
one government and one interagency process to make sure that veterans are treated
It's
fairly.
just amazing to me, Mr. Chairman, that the one item that deals with homeless veterans is zeroed out when this agency as a whole has a 15% increase across the board, and that there's plenty of money left over from the prior COVID packages. But Biden and Pelosi has said that a budget is a statement of your values and a statement of your priorities. And clearly, this budget, by zeroing out funding for homeless veterans, clearly shows the American people that this administration's budget and their values is zero for our homeless veterans, which I think is absolutely horrendous and not a priority of the House Republicans or the American people, for that matter. Actions speak louder than words, Madam Secretary. This administration is failing to uphold its promise to the men and women who served this nation proudly, some of who are sleeping on the streets in Missouri, and I think it's disgraceful that it was zeroed out. Now, President Biden has pledged to spend over $2 trillion on climate initiatives over the next 4 years, including $213 billion budget requests to produce and retrofit more than 2 million energy-efficient homes. Madam Secretary, how long will it take to produce and or retrofit these green units?
Well, every unit that we build today should be a green unit. We want climate efficiency. We want weatherization. We want people to live in places where their utility bills are not putting them out of their homes because they're too much. We want to be sure that we can have people live in efficient, energy-efficient properties. I mean, that is the process going forward that I think every single person should.
So how long will it take? That's my question.
How long will it take to do what?
To retrofit it into a green item, because I just don't want people sleeping on the streets.
Well, one of the things that we have to do is give us the money. Once we have the resources, then we can put in place the processes to make sure it happens.
How much
And
does
I
your
would-
agency have left over from the prior COVID packages?
Total, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I would say that about 90% of it is already out.
So it's interesting because according to CBO, in the Biden bailout bill in February, there was $5 billion for homeless assistance, and zero was going to be spent in the year 2021, and the rest was going to be spent the
Sir, that is
2022 and after.
absolutely not accurate.
This is what the Congressional Budget Office.
That was in February, we're in June.
So, and we're still in fiscal year 21. I'm just saying what the Congressional Budget Office said. So I would love for you to provide to the House Republicans
I'd be happy to.
that that's not accurate, and then we'll make sure the Congressional Budget Office says whether it's the
I'd be
case or
happy to
not.
get it to you, sir.
I appreciate that. So you don't know a timeline of whenever these green energy homes will be retrofitted. It's just whenever the money comes.
Well, certainly you have to plan. You know, we can't just say to people, oh, we have $1 million, go find something to do with it. We are very good stewards of taxpayers' dollars. And what we want is a plan and a timeline to make sure that the resources are being spent appropriately and timely.
Exactly. So will the timeline delay the availability of housing for homeless persons or someone in need whenever you do have this timeline?
Well, let me just tell you where we are now. The chairman talked about some 600, almost 600,000 people sleeping on the street. If we don't do something very, very quickly, we don't have places to put people now.
Yeah, my biggest concern is I don't want additional people sleeping on the street because we're just trying to green retrofit. And so
I think that that's really not a fair statement.
I just want to make sure that it is a priority, Madam Secretary, that
It
when you're
absolutely
looking
is
at
a priority.
retrofitting, that you put people before retrofitting and make sure that we allow as few as people to be sleeping on the streets just because of these green new proposals that's coming
No
forward.
one is
Thank
sleeping
you,
on the
Mr.
street
Chairman.
because of a green retrofit.
That's good to hear.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski, for 5 minutes. Nope, sorry. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me join you and other members in welcoming Secretary Marcia Fudge back to the House and to our committee. We had a good session on our Transportation HUD Appropriations Subcommittee, and now we have another round at the Budget Committee, and I'm grateful for that. Madam Secretary, I want to commend you first of all for the relentless message on the importance of turning around this housing crisis in this country and increasing our housing supply, making certain that we have a clear understanding that housing is infrastructure. You've said that repeatedly, and I want you to keep saying it because we have a huge stake in the passage of the American Jobs Plan and the inclusion of housing, full inclusion of housing as a component of America's infrastructure. I want to turn to another matter, disaster recovery, which is also, of course, within our HUD budget and something that has required a lot of attention in recent years, especially in areas like I represent, where we have repeated natural disasters and have reason to monitor this closely and to try to get the money flowing as quickly and efficiently as possible when people desperately need help. The THUD Appropriations Subcommittee has appropriated around $90 billion through this CDBG DR program, Disaster Relief Program, or Disaster Recovery Program, as we call it. And so we've experienced firsthand in North Carolina the effects of some of these hurdles that we have to clear and some of the delays we have to deal with. There are particular problems. There have been particular problems with Puerto Rico, and I want to ask you, first of all, how we're doing in getting some of those problems, those inequities corrected. And then I want to ask you some questions about the bigger picture, because this program's cumbersome even when it works well, even when it works the way it should. There are multiple checkpoints and the aid doesn't get out the way it should. But there were particular problems with Puerto Rico. We discovered in our hearing how some of those were, and we know there was a political aspect to that with President Trump and his attitude toward Puerto Rico. They recklessly held back aid. So I wonder if you could first provide us on a status update on the disaster recovery efforts in Puerto Rico and how those funds are flowing.
Certainly. And thank you for the question. I think that you will find, and I hope you will be pleased at what we have done since this administration took over this project. One of the things that we did was we streamlined the project. We made sure that we could get the resources out quickly. Right now, about 90% of all of the resources that should have gone out 7-8 years ago are out. What we do know, though, is that we need some kind of a permanent framework, Mr. Price, so that we can do this fairly, efficiently, and quickly. Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands should have seen significant increases in their allocations, and I'm very pleased at where we stand today.
Well, the repeated needs for Federal Register notices about disaster recovery, unmet need funds, about mitigation funds. It's a bewildering array sometimes of the checkpoints. We did pass an authorization, as you well know, in the last Congress,
Right.
an authorization of that DR program in the House, and it certainly would help if we could have an authorization. I understand that, and that one is on us. The I wonder if you have anything to say though about the Puerto Rico situation in particular. What has this administration specifically done to expedite that flow of funds and help where it's needed?
I have personally spoken with the governor. I have spoken with the representative here. We have come to a very good place as to how we move forward. Again, we have removed the person who did oversight because we thought that that was a clog in the process. And so we are moving very, very rapidly to be sure that we are providing not only the resources, but the technical assistance they need. And in my last conversation with the governor, he was very pleased at our progress.
All right. Well, that's good to hear. We do want to monitor that carefully along with you and to I visited the island, many members over the last few years since those devastating storms have had concerns about this, and so we do want to make sure that's expedited, and then understand also that this is part of a larger problem of the CDBG-DR money in many ways is the most flexible money we have. So that's a good thing, and that category is there for a reason. But we defeat some of the purpose if we have it too entangled in bureaucracy. So we appreciate your commitment to working that out. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Fudge, good to see you. Congratulations on your new role as Secretary. I think we can all agree we want every American to have access to housing and at a price that they can afford, and we don't want anybody to be in a situation of being homeless. So, I hope to be able to work with you in your role to help address some of these issues. I am concerned that the impacts of this budget will negatively impact the affordability of housing and will overwhelm some of the work that's being done at HUD. We're seeing massive new spending at a scale that we haven't seen before, which is clearly resulting in, due to expansion of the money supply to support that spending, inflation. And I don't think it's going to be short term. I think we will see sustained inflation like we haven't seen in decades as a result of the policies of this administration, which will make housing more unaffordable and will make individuals' dollars less able to provide for their needs. Are you concerned about how inflation will impact the affordability of housing?
Well, I'm concerned about inflation generally. But I think that if you look at what economists are saying today, the majority are saying that there may be some inflation, but at this point, they are not concerned about it being long-term, nor are they concerned about it doing something like increasing the cost of housing. What is increasing the cost of housing today is things like lack of materials. I met with the home builders. They told me it cost them an additional $32,000 in the purchase of materials and time to build a home.
Per home, yes.
Yeah, another $13,000 because of zoning that makes it more difficult for them to build the type of housing that they can build quickly. And so that is a much bigger cost than inflation would make it.
Well, that is inflation. The price of lumber going up 300%
Some of it is as a result of
inflation.
COVID, that they don't have the materials.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing exactly what you are, and it's making homes that much more affordable for so many more American families. So, I'm, again, want to work with you, but, the department, as a part of the overall budget, you're proposing an increase of 15% in spending. And I'd like to hear how you intend to address the operations of the department. As I'm sure you know, in September last year, the GAO found that at HUD, there are 20 different entities administering 160 programs. So, I think surely some of those programs are duplicative. Some are probably more cost-effective than others. And in fact, there are quite a few studies out there that have found just that. According to HUD data, before its most recent allocation, the Housing Trust Fund, just one particular program, received more than $1.19 billion since fiscal year 2016. Yet through February 2021, more than 2/3 of those funds remain undispersed. And from the funds that have been dispersed, the Housing Trust Fund has completed production of only 800 units of housing. So that's a 5-year production rate. That would equate to one completed unit of housing for every $1.5 million in the fund. Your budget, as I mentioned, not only is 15% increase, but requests $45 billion over the next 5 years for the Housing Trust Fund. Could you please justify why you need more dollars for this fund when it has such an inefficient track record?
Well, I think that you've kind of hit the nail on the head, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but let me just be clear about this. All the programs that HUD runs have been authorized by this Congress. I didn't make them up. You know, I think that it is time for us to take a look. I don't disagree with you at all. I think it is time for us to see if we can be more efficient, if we can be better, and so I'd love to work with you with
So
that.
what plans do you have to create more efficiency in that particular program or in others as well?
Well, I think that probably maybe sometimes people don't really understand what the Housing Trust Fund is for. Yes, it assists in building houses, but the primary purpose is to bring down the cost of housing. It is to be it kind of fills the gap for what a house would cost and what we can, how we can make it affordable. So
Well,
as
if the
houses,
primary purpose is to bring down the cost of housing,
Well,
at this
to
point,
build and to
it's
bring down
dramatically
the
failing
cost.
at that, yeah.
well, no, that's really what it is for. And so we put the resources into the trust fund in order to make housing affordable. It is specifically directed at low-income and moderate-income people. That is what the program is for. And I think that for the most part, I can't speak to what happened before I came, but for the most part, we are on track to do what is necessary to be done. And as it relates to how you talked about our staffing, which I'm so pleased that you did. In 2019, we went down to 6,000 staff, lower than it has ever been. At one point in this country, housing made up about 7% of the budget. It is less than 1%. So then when we sit and wonder why our public housing is so bad, why there has not been any real investment in new housing, why the housing is in the shape it's in, because we've disinvested. We have not kept up for decades with what we should be doing to make public housing decent, to build new housing. We are 11 million houses short of where people need to live today. And so at some point, we have to say to ourselves, do we really want to make this better? Or we want to just keep putting Band-Aids on it? This budget wants to make it better.
Thank you, I'm out of time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. It was a pleasure to serve with you, and now it's such a pleasure to see you in this position. So I am very concerned because at the end of this month, which is coming up, the CDC extension on the moratorium on evictions ends. I was relieved when the HUD moratorium ended in March that the CDC came through with one. I wanted to ask you, what is the plan? Because it's forgiveness, it's not forgiveness of the money that's owed. And so what is the plan for all the people now who have this accumulated amount of money that they owe to the landlords, and what's going to happen to the landlords?
First off, thank you. It's good to see you.
So good to see you.
As you know, the CDC is the entity that actually issues the moratorium, and I do know that they are having some discussions. I don't know at this point what the outcome is going to be, but I know what we need to do right now is to be sure that our communities, and I've had many, many conversations with mayors and others, get the resources out. There is a bottleneck because when the resources were sent out, there was no technical assistance, no direction. And so we send money to these communities through the Treasury, and the Treasury at the time did not have the capacity to tell them how these funds should be and could be used. And so they didn't use them. And so now what we are seeing, now that they have the kind of direction and technical assistance that we have been giving, the resources are coming out much quicker. But we need to get that $45 billion through the system so that the landlords can be paid. I mean, I think that certainly we need to bring in landlords more and have conversations with them about how these resources can be helpful. But I do think that you will see that the numbers are coming up significantly, exponentially, month by month, now that people understand what the process is, and of course, the urgency of June 30th.
So is that amount of money sufficient to actually prevent people from being left on the street now, that they could be evicted at this point?
Well, I would say this. It is sufficient enough to keep people from being evicted on June 30th if the money gets through the system, because it can bring most people current, whether they be renters or whether they have, or whether they're homeowners. But I just do believe that we have to make sure that every community, and especially rural and smaller communities who are having the most difficulty, because most of them don't have the kinds of staffs to be able to take in these resources and don't have the capacity within their structures to get these resources out. So we need to really put more time and attention toward the smaller and rural communities, because that's where a lot of this is lacking, because they just don't have the capacity to do it.
Yeah, let me ask you on a different question. I wanted to talk to you about exclusionary zoning rules. We heard from Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Walter, how do you say it? Adiyama, I think is what it is. That this is a problem, and I wondered if you could just discuss that a little bit about exclusionary zoning rules.
I'd be happy to. I mean, I think one of the things that, even having been a mayor myself, some of the things that we don't really think about is we have these zoning ordinances that have been around sometimes for decades and decades that we really don't take a look at. So maybe what we need to do is stop and have a conversation about how exclusionary zoning rules are making it more difficult, not only to build new housing, but for people to move to communities that they can afford to live in under normal circumstances without the additional cost. So let's just take something simple like requirements for so many parking spaces, let's say, or for a certain width of a driveway or a certain lot size. When I was a mayor, the community right next to mine required you to have a 2-acre lot before you could build a new home. It made it almost impossible for a normal, average, moderate income person to live in that community. But that law had been on the books for 50 or 60 years. And so what we want to do is have conversations, but I want to be clear, because I've heard this a number of times. We are not dictating or demanding that anyone change their zoning laws. What we want to do is make them aware of how difficult that they are making it for people to build homes and for us to move people into those communities who need housing.
Perfect. I appreciate that. And my time is up. Yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jacobs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Great to be here, and I just wanted to mention my first job out of college was working at HUD here in Washington, D.C. I worked in the first Bush and Kemp administration in the Office of Policy Development when we passed the HOPE program. And actually, after several years at HUD, I left and went with a couple people to work in public housing communities, working to help implement resident management grants for residents taking over management responsibilities and entrepreneurship in public housing, giving them a more vested position in their housing. So it's great to be here and talking about housing policy. I also owned a small development company in Buffalo, New York, doing revitalization of older structures in downtown Buffalo. I just wanted to, as we are representatives representing areas throughout the country, I just wanted to relay something recently that had come up in my area as we talk about the need for more affordable housing and additional public housing, additional aid to public housing. Certainly, I'm sure you agree, a lot of affordable housing is still provided by small landlords who own several units, may have a double where they live in one and then lease out the other. The other day I met a couple. They were immigrants from India, and they had obviously over a good period of time built up a significant real estate holding of affordable residential properties. New York State still has the moratorium on rent and they're at a point now that they have not received rent for well over a year from many of these tenants, and my second point of this, the rental assistance is finally coming through in New York State. But the problem they've been having is they are honoring, of course, the moratorium on mandating rent, but they have financing through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and they have found that there was been no flexibility there to work with them on the other side. You know, they're not receiving rent, but there's not any grace period on payments and so forth. So I don't know more about that, but I just want to relay a concern. And then the other thing I would mention is just recently, finally, the Cuomo administration has starting to get out money of the rental assistance that came from the federal government. The problem is that money requires, for the landlord to attain that money, that rental assistance, the tenant has to concede to that. There's really no incentive for the tenant to say, I agree. So they have been unable to get any assistance with that. And my concern is this individual has now been forced to sell several properties to continue to pay the loans on other properties. My concern is we could get to a point, if this gets more protracted, that we're going to have people turning over the keys to banks, and we are actually going in reverse in terms of housing stock and affordability. So I wish I had more specifics about that, but I just wanted to relay that to you. I'm supportive of the rental assistance. I understand that this, you know, we want people to be able to stay in their homes during this crisis, but we don't want to be creating another crisis, a longer-term crisis as a result.
I very much agree, and I thank you, and I'll make sure that I check, and we'll get with you about this person, because FHA and they should be working with them. Not only have they been instructed to do so, but at least since I've been there for sure, but also we have agreements with our mortgage servicers. We have done everything we believe that we should have done, so I need to figure out how they fell through the cracks, and I want to be helpful in any way I can. And secondly, tenants, if in hindsight, there are probably some things that should have happened differently. But I would say to you that if tenants do have an incentive, because they will be on the street if they knew the whole purpose of this is not only to just keep people in their apartments or homes, but to make the landlords whole as well. And so if we're failing on that part, then we have some work.
Yeah, I'll say in New York, we're failing on that part. We'll never make these landlords whole, and I think there will unfortunately be some tenants who decide they're going to milk this as long as they can, and then they'll just go somewhere else, and there's no consequences on their credit and anything like that. So
we need to look at that then.
But thank you. I will follow up with you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Secretary Fudge. It's good to see you. Thank you for being here. One area of policy that you and I have both worked on over our years together in Congress has been supporting the older industrial cities in this country, particularly those affected by globalization, by changes in those communities due to trade impacts, technology, et cetera. And I know we share a concern that the places that have been left behind be given the support they need in order to connect to the 21st century economy. I have an initiative in the Ways and Means Committee that creates a new approach to trade adjustment assistance for communities, specifically to provide trade-impacted, distressed communities federal support and technical assistance to help them design and execute an economic redevelopment plan, essentially connecting them to the new economy. One of the goals of the Biden administration, which you are responsible for executing in this budget, is to address the issues of inequality in our economy, in our society. And I believe that the economic issues facing our older industrial cities relate to this inequality of opportunity based on place. It often just depends on where you live as to whether or not you have access to opportunities. So my initiative to provide trade adjustment assistance for communities is one step to begin to correct this. But I know you, through the HUD budget proposal, include a $10 billion community revitalization fund, specifically to support redevelopment projects in communities that have suffered from chronic disinvestment. So, Madam Secretary, I wonder if you might discuss your vision for this proposal and also comment on how Congress might be helpful in supporting and implementing, I think, what is a really important effort to create greater equality in our economy.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I spoke to the mayor of Detroit not too long ago about a choice neighborhood grant. I think it was $35 million. I'm just doing that off the top of my head, Representative Kildee. But what we are trying to do now is take those kinds of communities and create transformational change. For them to get a $35 million grant, a one-time 35, at one time, the planning that went into their project, the way that it is going to be executed is going to be transformational, and I promise you that it is going to make other communities realize what the federal government can do when we have the will to do it and make it happen. As it relates to the Revitalization Fund, the fund would provide about $500 million in planning grants, which is something that communities, especially smaller communities, do not have the capacity to do. So we're going to make sure that the planning is done, and then we're going to provide about almost $10 billion in implementation funds for these community investment projects. So I think that you'll see, once we can get through this process, and if in fact this budget and the President's jobs plan is approved, you'll see a significant difference in the resources that are going to be available to do the things that you're talking about doing. And I'd love to see your plan, quite frankly.
I really appreciate that. We see with trade adjustment assistance a specific set of targeted communities that have been chronically left behind due to the massive changes in our economy related to trade and technology. But as you know, one of the big challenges that these communities face, and so I'm so pleased to hear the way you conceptualize this program, is that the communities themselves, the local government capacity, even the private sector capacity is often quite thin. And of course, we have this expectation that all communities need is the resource. They do need financial resources, public and private capital. But in order to put together an effective strategy, they need technical help, technical support. And I've spent a lot of my career before coming to Congress working in older communities that are struggling. And I think it's important that the federal government recognize that. And so that's why I'm pleased that this effort will address that. So thank you for that.
Thank you, and of course, you know, I'm very aware, my hometown is Cleveland.
Right.
And so we have much in common, so thank you.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, thanks for your work. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes. Okay. Then I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes. Okay. We won't start the clock on you until you're ready.
There we go, right behind me there. Thank you, Secretary Fudge, for being with us. Thank you, Chairman, for recognizing me this morning, and appreciate all of my colleagues' input as well. Secretary Fudge, earlier the ranking member mentioned the Biden-Harris border crisis in his remarks, and I wanted to follow up on that and to reiterate what he asked about. I think it's safe to say the Biden agenda is in shambles in many ways, and particularly as it pertains to the disaster at the border and the failure to enforce our existing immigration laws. HUD recently issued a guidance stating that the agency is not requiring applicants to provide Social Security numbers with the submission of their emergency housing voucher applications, which is in violation of existing law. Obviously, this will act as an incentive or a further incentive for more illegal border crossings. And while the so-called border czar, Vice President Harris, has timidly asked illegal immigrants not to come across the border, the policy of this administration, in fact, welcomes illegal immigrants with open arms, seeks to accommodate and facilitate those crossings, whether instead of preventing those. And these policies will further overrun our public housing system. Secretary Fudge, Vice President Harris's failure in leadership as board czar has directly resulted in your department being forced to prioritize illegal immigrants over Americans, American taxpayers. Do you plan on confronting her for her failure of leadership in this regard?
First off, sir, let me just be very clear. I'm not going to allow you to continue to be dishonest about what we are doing. I represent HUD. I don't represent Homeland Security. I represent HUD. And I have said, and I said to your ranking member, and I will say to you, sir, we are not, have not, and will not prioritize illegal aliens of any kind over American citizens. And I very much resent that you continue to say it.
Well, if American citizens have to provide Social Security numbers to apply for these vouchers, and illegal aliens do not, how is that not prioritizing illegal aliens?
It is not that they do not. I have said, and I will repeat myself, that they are required to provide information. The public housing authorities.
Excuse me, what you said was that they could get the voucher, and then they're supposed to provide the Social Security number later at some point in time, and you didn't give a point. When is the requirement they would have to do that by? And how long does it take? You didn't have an answer. You didn't have an answer for us on when they would have to provide that Social Security number after receiving the voucher, and how long that would take.
And I said I would get back to you with that number.
But so it seems like we are providing the voucher first without the Social Security number, but then we're saying they've got to get back to us with the Social Security number. What was the rationale behind HUD's guidance to make these housing benefits less secure by not requiring in advance, in order to receive the voucher, the Social Security number for these applicants?
I don't believe that they're less secure.
To not why would someone not be able to provide a Social Security number at the time of application?
That is a process that is put in place by our public housing authorities. I don't know. I said I
Is there any reason why a person who has a Social Security number would not be able to provide that at the time of application?
Absolutely. Do you know homeless people don't carry around wallets? People who sleep on the streets.
So you're suggesting that
often have no identification at all.
So well,
Do you have a Social Security card in your pocket? I don't.
I asked, can they provide a Social Security number?
As I said to you, most homeless people have many issues. Besides being homeless, many of them have.
Let me change gears with
emotional and mental
excuse
ill-
me.
mental
Let me change
problems.
gears for a moment. The remaining minute that I have. The president's budget requests over $800 million for climate initiatives pushed by the liberal elites and progressive Democrats. How do you think these climate priorities help hardworking families who are simply trying to put food on the table?
Well, I think that they help because if you live in Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama and you've been hit by a bad storm, you want to be sure that when you rebuild, that you won't be in the same situation again.
As a former mayor, and you mentioned this previously, this budget proposes to use federal dollars to coerce local governments into changing their zoning land use and development policy and regulation, most egregiously through the AFFH initiative. Federal law actually prohibits the conditioning of grants on a state or local government adopting, continue, or discontinuing any public policy, regulation, or law. It's disappointing that this administration would propose this in spite of the laws. We don't have time for you to answer, but thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Madam Secretary, would you like to answer that question? Or?
No.
Okay. Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Yarmouth. I want to thank you for holding this hearing. Secretary Fudge, it's great to see you. We miss you. And the Congressional Black Caucus is especially proud of your confirmation. I wanted to allow an opportunity for the record to be clarified. The ranking member implied, as he calls it, the Biden bailout bill, it's really the American Rescue Plan, does not fully support funding for veteran housing. However, the information that I have is that it's $2.1 billion in this current budget proposal, which is an increase of $335 million, or 14.5% from last fiscal year. So, Madam Secretary, can you talk about the coordination between HUD and the VA in the allocation of this investment of more than $2.1 billion of funding?
Thank you so very much for allowing me the time. There are currently 22,000 veteran vouchers that are unused and still available. That is why we did not necessarily need to put in the budget the increase. The resources are there. We're just not asking for any more at this stage because we have vouchers available and the VA has vouchers. The problem is, Mr. Horsford, is that for some time, just as with HUD, VA over the last 4 years also did not have the capacity to make sure that we got the vouchers out. And so now that is happening because people are put in place to make sure that happens.
Thank you. And also, several of my colleagues on the other side have criticized the programs of the Housing and Urban Development, despite the fact that most of their criticism is of the former HUD Secretary, Ben Carson, and the prior administration. And so I would just urge them to take responsibility for their own actions of what they did to weaken HUD during the prior administration. Madam Secretary, you recently spoke in an interview about the role that student loan debt plays in limiting homeownership for Black people. Black people are especially impacted by student loan debt, while 29% of bachelor's degree recipients in 2016 graduated without debt. Only 14% of Black graduates were able to do so. This debt keeps people from saving up for a down payment and qualifying for home loans. The racial disparity in homeownership and education is evident as the homeownership rate for Black people who graduated from college is only 3.2 percentage points higher than that of white high school dropouts. So obtaining an education should open doors and improve quality of life, not put up barriers from building wealth for themselves and future generations. So how does the requested budget support HUD's efforts to increase Black homeownership, and what specific tools within HUD currently exist to promote and support home ownership as a part of infrastructure in our country?
The first thing about home ownership is we have put in this budget $100 million to assist in first-time homeowners. And what we have found, and I'm glad you mentioned the student debt piece, what we have found is that most people of color come out of school with student debt that amounts to almost $60,000, where non-people of color come out with less than half that amount. And what HUD has systematically done through FHA is weight that student debt higher than any other kind of credit. And so it has prevented people who are poor or people of color who come out with significant amounts of debt from being creditworthy and getting a loan. And so what we have done is level the playing field there. As well as we are looking at how we assess credit. You know, we look at the credit reporting agencies, et cetera. We know that there is discrimination built into that process. The third thing we are doing, and I'm excited about it, is that we are looking at how we appraise properties. And third, and fourth, and probably lastly about this, we have historically disinvested in poor neighborhoods because we won't give loans less than $75,000. So if you have a neighborhood that has a lot of housing that is empty, and you can get it for $20 or $30 or $50,000, we won't loan you the money to do it. And so what we have done is created blight by not investing in these communities and allowing people to buy these homes. So those are just kind of in a nutshell the things we're doing.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I look forward to working with you. We have a choice neighborhood in our district that I look forward to partnering with HUD on, and really appreciate your leadership. And I would just encourage my colleagues, let's work together for the American people. This is not a bailout bill. It's the American Rescue Plan. It's for all Americans. Your constituents benefit, Mr. Smith, just like mine. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes.
Welcome back to the House.
Thank you.
Glad to see your face. Okay, couple quick questions. I personally believe that people are coming here illegally, are winding up in low-income housing, but I'm going to ask you this question. As far as I can tell, about 70,000 people a month are crossing the border who we wouldn't necessarily want here or aren't picking, either on asylum claims or just on what they call gotaways. Will you acknowledge that when you're getting 70,000 people a month coming across the southern border, that part of the housing crisis, if we do have a housing crisis or a housing shortage, is because of those 70,000 people?
No, sir, I will not acknowledge that. We had a housing crisis long before the border crisis. And secondly, I don't know how many people come across the border.
Okay, well, Kamala went down to or the vice president went down to the border, she could ask the Border Patrol and she'd tell them. They tell her. Okay, I hear from when I tour the low-income housing in my district that some of the people moving into the low-income housing are moving there from their parents' house. Does that ever happen?
Oh, I have no idea.
Well, I guess the question I'm trying to say is, to me, if I'm a 24-year-old or I'm a 24-year-old with a child and I'm living with my mother, I'm not sure I need subsidized housing because they already have housing. I mean, a lot of people do live with their parents. Do you think under any circumstances, people who have a bedroom and are living with their parents should move into subsidized housing?
Sir, I can't make those decisions for people, how they should live their
Okay.
lives.
Next question. I realize Section 42 is part of the Internal Revenue Code, but it's a big part of low-income housing assistance in this country. I receive complaints from individuals and people who build apartments, and that they feel the Section 42 housing is much superior to housing that is not low-income. In other words, you're giving people who are low-income superior housing to people who don't. Could you comment on this? And I also feel the Section 42 housing gives large tax credits to sometimes very wealthy people. So you're benefiting a lot of very wealthy people and building units that are, whether I talk to the tenants or the builders of the property, you're giving superior quality housing to people in the low-income brackets. Could you comment on Section 42, and you think I'm right in that?
No, Section 42 comes under the Treasury Department.
Well, right.
Low-income housing tax.
I know, I said
credits
I know
are
it's
the
the
Treasury.
IRS, but
That's a question for Treasury,
well, I mean, it's such a big part of the low-income housing in this country. You don't
except for
have-
that I don't control it.
So you don't notice it.
Neither does HUD.
So you're not gonna count. Okay, this is kind of a larger question. I think, well, I'll say this about Section 42. Would you mind if we got rid of Section 42 and gave it to you so that all the low-income housing programs are under one roof? Since Section 42 is such a large amount of what we do for low-income housing in the country?
If Congress, within its wisdom, wants to give me those resources, fine with me.
Okay. There's an author I know who talks about, difficult areas, actually not even in this country, but in his country, he felt that they had given people, no matter how you behaved, you got all the food you'd want, free medical care, and free housing. And he felt a lot of the difficulties in his country were due to the fact that people, no matter how they behaved, got medical care, all the medical care they need, all the food they need, and all the housing they need. Do you think that could be a problem in this country?
No.
It is not a problem if, however you behave, you get those three things?
I know a whole lot of people that don't have health care.
Well, if you have, that's probably true, but I mean, people who get on Medicaid do have health care, correct?
Well, people who get on Medicaid, some, yes, they do have Medicaid, correct?
That's right, that would be called having medical care. Right.
If you're on Medicaid, correct.
That's right. So do you see a problem in society that no matter how you behave, if we set up a society in which you always get housing, food, and medical care, do you think that is a problem? Maybe a problem in the family structure you're encouraging, maybe a
That is
problem.
not what our society does.
I'm under the impression that's what it does. Okay, I guess those are my questions, and I wish you'd think about them, because I think a lot of our problems in society stem from our safety net, and I think maybe the one that's administered worse is the housing part of the safety net, but thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. Good to see you, Madam Secretary, and congratulations. We miss you, but you are the right woman for the right time.
Thank you.
First of all, let me thank you for answering these questions with clarity. You're being very gracious in how you answer them. But I just have to be, and I know you're very direct, I'm very direct, and I have to just say to you, the last administration, it was disastrous. It totally neglected our housing assistance programs. And I hope those who are asking you these questions recognize the fact that the last administration did nothing for addressing all of the issues that our secretary now is trying to address by having to repair the damage of the last 4 years and still provide for affordable, safe, and decent housing. And I know this very well. In my district, for example, we suffer from challenges with homelessness and housing insecurity. The Bay Area accounts for 30% of the total levels of homelessness in the United States. We have the nation's highest rate of unhoused people at 73%. It grew exponentially during the last administration. This number has grown almost 4 times faster than the overall regional population. And so I wanted to ask you, just in terms of specific approaches HUD is taking to deal with specific challenges of high-cost areas and making sure that, and it's primarily people of color, don't face an unequal burden, the unequal burden of housing costs. And then secondly, again, because of the neglect, only 1 in 4 households eligible for rental assistance receive any help from the federal government, specifically Black and brown people. Almost 2/3 of renters with severe cost burdens are people of color. President Biden thankfully has proposed expanding housing support to all eligible households, and his budget proposes an additional 200,000 vouchers to begin. And so just wanted to kind of get your sense of how this scale of assistance will fulfill the promise to make these vouchers available to everyone who needs them. And so thank you again very much for your leadership and for being here.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate it. Let me say this, Ms. Lee. California probably is doing the best across the country in dealing with this homelessness situation because they have by far the lion's share of homeless people. So one of the things that the mayors are doing right now, and I've talked to Mayor Breed and I've talked to Garcetti and mayors all across California, and they are taking advantage of the $5 billion that Congress allocated to create housing. So they are doing things like buying motels and hotels. They are finding ways to get homeless people out of congregate shelters. They are finding ways to get people on the street because they have done such a good job at identifying where they are, where we find them, what stakeholders work with them best. And so they are working with our on-the-ground stakeholders, and they are making tremendous strides, whether it's in LA or Santa Monica or Oakland. I'm really happy about what is happening there. It's a big job, and there's still much to do, but they started planning early. And so their plans are working now. Instead of what some of your colleagues are saying, we just throw money at people. They planned. You can't just take every dollar and just go out and just willy-nilly decide, oh, I'm going to spend it here. It takes planning. And your communities are doing it very, very well.
Madam Secretary, just in terms of the rental assistance as it relates to vouchers, and I'm so pleased to see the commitment to expand now and add additional 200,000 vouchers. Have you all decided how to make sure that these vouchers are going to be spread around so everyone who needs them will receive them?
What we're doing now is trying to make sure that instead of just using the formulas that we normally use, is to get them to the communities who have the greatest needs. And so you're not going to see a standard formula. We're going to start right now even transferring some of those vouchers now to places that are out of them already. And many of those places happen to be in California, quite frankly. But what we are also seeing is that the cost of housing in California is so high that it is creating problems just being able to get people into housing. Because the cost is just, the costs are rising so much, and we know this across the country. There's no place in this country today where a person making a minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Nowhere. And when you look at the continually rising cost of housing across this country, even though we have vouchers, it's still hard to place people because so many people will not accept the voucher. So it's kind of a catch-22 in some respects, but we are moving vouchers to places where we know they have used them and need more.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a lot of hope that finally we'll be able to address many of the structural issues as it relates to housing. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. Appreciate your work here. Madam Secretary, Congress over the past 6 months has appropriated $46 billion in rental assistance. And I believe it was last month, Republicans on the Financial Services Committee wrote to the Treasury requesting an accounting of all emergency rental assistance funds that had been distributed. And the Treasury Department has not provided those figures to us. Now, I understand you're not with Treasury. However, this money was appropriated to ultimately end up in your department and to go for something that you have jurisdiction over, and that is the rental assistance. Can you provide us with an update regarding how much of the $46 billion has already been provided to renters to settle back rent debts and protect renters from facing eviction?
I can get that information from you from Treasury. I'd be happy to.
Thank you, because obviously Treasury is ignoring us, but
I'd be happy to get whatever they have.
Thank you very much for that. On the other side of the issue with the evictions, and none of us want to see renters evicted because of what has happened. However, we have to be cognitive of the fact that there is another side of that, and that includes the landlords and the property owners. The CDC eviction moratorium expires a week from today. How many of these landlords, and many of these landlords, I should say, are small business owners, and they depend on this income on their rental properties? What's HUD doing to ensure that debts are paid to property owners and how fraud can be prevented?
Well, we are providing all the assistance, not just to Treasury to assist them, but our staffs are in place. We're having weekly meetings with landlords. We have website information that any of them can access. We have our staff available to answer any questions, and we are speaking directly with local and state governments as to how they can get the resources out faster, because the majority of the money has actually been allocated. It's just that these communities, especially smaller and rural ones, are not getting them out fast enough. Now, some major cities do, but part of the problem is just was the capacity to get it out. Some of these communities just don't have the people to make sure it happens properly. So that's where we're stepping in at HUD and trying to provide that kind of assistance.
And I appreciate that, and I'm not going to dispute what you said because I think you're right. We've gotten calls in our office from so many people who are landlords and wondering when they're going to get the rent and when it's going to happen. And there have been bottlenecks in the process. There's been bottlenecks at the state level as well. We need to understand that. And at the local levels.
Most of it is state, quite frankly.
Thank you, and that's what we've experienced in Georgia, so I will tell you that. But nevertheless, thank you for intervening in that and making sure that that happens. That's very important. I want to switch gears now and talk about homelessness, and specifically the Housing First, which gives homeless housing, and that's something I think we all agree with that needs to happen. But when we look at the root cause of homelessness, we understand a lot of it has to do with addiction, a lot of it has to do with mental illnesses, and we all want to shift the nation's homelessness policy toward better outcomes. I think we all agree on that. Unfortunately, it appears that in certain areas we're not making the progress that we hope to make, especially when you look at a lot of our major cities. Perhaps there's a need to change the approach. Perhaps there's a need to change our approach to the issue. Would you support a treatment-first policy which provides housing but also requires participation in drug treatment, mental health, and employment programs?
Well, I don't know that I would support requiring it, because I think that this Congress has also, even when I was a member, did not believe that we should force people to do things.
Even treatment, not even getting mental health or addiction treatment?
I don't know that we can legally do that. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think that yes, we need to find ways to change our approach in some ways. I think we do need to address the root issues. I don't disagree with that at all. But I don't know that mandating that someone get treatment first off, is constitutional.
So if there is someone living in a HUD building, a HUD provided home, and we know that they have an addiction problem, we know that they have a mental health problem, we don't have any recourse whatsoever?
I do not believe so, sir. I mean, this is still a country, we talked about it earlier. We follow the law and we follow the Constitution, and I don't believe that either of those give us that authority.
Well, would you be in favor of a treatment first program, though? Obviously, I don't want us spinning our wheels. I want to help these people. And you know, as a healthcare professional, as a pharmacist, I can tell you addiction is a big problem, and it's one of the biggest problems we have with homelessness. So I hope we
certainly support it. I certainly support treatment. Oh, absolutely.
I understand, but somehow we got to make this happen. I don't want the heavy hand of government intervening either. However, I hope that we can work towards some kind of solution to help these people get the help that they need.
I'm certainly happy to talk to you about it. I'd love for it to happen as well.
Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Secretary Fudge. It's so thrilling to see you appear before our committee. Thank you for putting forth a budget that reflects the tremendous housing needs facing our country. And it's no accident that both Congressmember Barbara Lee and I are asking about homelessness, because in California, it is a huge issue. And certainly in Southern California, it is. And in fact, despite moving more people than ever into permanent housing, the 2020 homelessness count in Los Angeles County, which includes my district, increased 13% year after year. Housing is becoming less affordable, and more of our neighbors are falling into homelessness each year than we can actually house. But there's still examples of progress, including in a city in my district, Pasadena, which has seen homelessness decrease by 65% since 2011, thanks to investments in permanent supportive housing. So I'm glad to see that the administration is requesting $3.5 billion for homeless assistance in fiscal year 2022, including $3.1 billion to increase funding for the Continuum of Care program, which is our main tool to reduce homelessness over the long term. Can you explain how you plan to invest this increase in Continuum of Care funding between renewals and new grants, and talk about the importance of the local partnership model in increasing homelessness, particularly in the wake of the COVID pandemic?
Thank you so much. It's good to see you as well. We know that our Continuums of Care program funds do help us with this program. We could not do it without the assistance of people on the ground. And so what we are doing is giving grants, and in some instances, we are working with people who we know have a track record of being successful in addressing the homelessness issue. Because I think sometimes people also forget that when homelessness becomes a way of life for some people, these tent communities, et cetera, they become very entrenched in wanting to be homeless because that is their safe place. And so it takes people with real skill to help people get off the street. I mean, they literally create their own hierarchies of who runs it and what they do, especially with veterans because of their training. So it is very difficult in some instances for them to trust the government to do what is best for them. So we couldn't do it without the Continuums of Care. I appreciate the fact that you recognize that this $3.5 billion is significant. And what we are hoping is that we can serve as many as 750,000 people with these resources.
Well, thank you. And Secretary Fudge, as a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, I'm interested in finding new revenue streams to support affordable housing construction, because we need to invest in housing supply to make housing more affordable. HUD's congressional budget justification estimates that Fannie and Freddie Mac will contribute $371 million to the National Housing Trust Fund this year. Yet advocates and other members of Congress, including myself, have asked for $45 billion for the trust fund, including $26 billion reserved for permanent supportive housing. Has the administration given thought to additional ways to raise revenue to direct to the trust fund?
Well, you know, the trust fund is funded through GSEs, through Fannie and Freddie. And we're looking at how we can make it easier and how we can make it more effective. So I think that the administration is looking at it, but just as a reminder, this is a top line kind of a budget. We've not gotten down into the real specifics at this stage for some of the things that you're asking about. But the good thing is that I am on the board that oversees the GSEs, and it's something that, it's a conversation that we'll take up.
Thanks. And to the question about people's addictions and mental illness, I have legislation on sober living homes for recovery residences. Do you see that it might be possible to formalize a more permanent funding stream for these kind of facilities, including formalizing HUD's role in their oversight, so that we could work together on such facilities?
You know, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about it. I think it's a great idea, and let's talk about it. You know, I can't make a commitment at this point, but I'm really happy to discuss it with you.
That would be fantastic. Thank you so much. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time and now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Secretary, congratulations on the position. I know that as a former member of Congress, you and I share a passion for making sure that the resources that we have to use to solve problems like homelessness are used as effectively as possible. And to that end, I wanted to ask a question that's been kind of vexing me. I represent among the cities in my district, the city of Hesperia, that's been involved in a lawsuit for the last 5 years with the department. They had an ordinance that they passed over 5 years ago.
Well, I was able to actually get that third one in there. And the funny thing is, she said exactly.
Thank you. So over 5 years ago, the city had an ordinance on the books that allowed landlords to evict tenants that were convicted of crimes committed around rental properties. The department sued. The city council later modified that ordinance to make it voluntary instead of compulsory, and then later rescinded the ordinance entirely. And yet here we are 5 years later, still in court over that ordinance. And I'm struggling to understand why it's taking up city resources, it's taking up department resources, and I'm just struggling to understand why the department would be continuing to pursue litigation about that.
Well, I'm going to be just very honest with you. I don't know about this lawsuit. I will find out about it. And if there's something we can do to bring it to some conclusion, I'm happy to try to work it out.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I think that'd probably be best for all involved and would give us resources to do other things with. Second question, yeah. Second question for you concerns those resources. In my district, I represent a lot of military bases, and therefore I represent a lot of veterans. And as you know, we have a pervasive problem with homelessness in veterans that we have been struggling to solve. I was a little dismayed to see that the budget that you are proposing does not include dedicated funding for the VA supportive housing program. And I wondered if you could tell us why that wasn't a priority.
Well, it is a priority. We have 22,000 available VA vouchers right now that are going to continue to be available. So we believe that there are enough vouchers in the system, 22,000 that are unused. And we are working with the VA to try to be sure that we can get those vouchers out to the people who need them. But it is a process that really goes through VA. It really doesn't come through HUD. We provide the vouchers because it is housing. But contacting the veterans to get them into the VASH program really goes through VA.
Right. I think we share a goal of making sure that those vouchers are issued to anyone that needs them.
Absolutely.
Just to point out, as I'm sure you're aware, the VASH program includes case management, which is, you know, a lot more critical than just giving someone a voucher. It's making sure that they're on a path to transitioning back into a house situation. And I think that that's one of the things that I really value about that program. So if we could work together to make that happen, I think it'd be a benefit not just to the district, but to everybody.
We'd be happy to, but that's also part of the problem. They haven't had the case managers. So their numbers were down so much, they didn't have the case managers to get to the vouchers. I agree 100%.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to meet you. Look forward to working with you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Pleasure, thank you.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Now recognize the gentlewoman from the U.S. Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Madam Secretary, for being here. It's an honor to question you this morning on the work that you all are doing and the tremendous mission that you have to accomplish at HUD. Wanted to talk with you, you know, it's so interesting that the phrase HUD is urban development, but HUD as well has so much work that's done in rural areas as well. And so I wanted to ask you about funding that's available for the home funds, which can be used for construction and rehabilitation housing for home ownership in areas where adequate supply or substandard houses are available. What is your commitment to ensuring that those funds are necessarily going to those communities that have not seen it as yet?
I commit to you, I'm going to take a good look at it and figure out what we can do to be helpful. It is certainly a pleasure to see you, and obviously we've had conversations in the past about the Virgin Islands in particular, and I am more than happy to work with you and your staff to be sure that you get what is appropriate for your district.
Thank you. You know, I'm concerned about areas like the Virgin Islands, those rural areas, which really need the technical support. You know, I heard a colleague talking additionally about the choice neighborhoods. These are grant programs, and oftentimes rural areas, underserved areas don't have the technical support to be able to meet the criteria for some of these grants. To use those, their communities very much fit the mission of the program, but they don't have the support for the grants. So having your commitment with that would be very much appreciated. The other thing I wanted to talk about, Congressman Price brought this up related to Puerto Rico, and you expanded it, thank you very much for that, to talk about the Virgin Islands. And I want to commend HUD under your leadership for releasing long-awaited disaster recovery funds for the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. After the devastation of the 2017 hurricanes of Irma and Maria, this Congress appropriated over $21 billion to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, over $22 billion. And yet we were unable to see that for the entirety of the Trump administration. There was always some hiccups and always additional publication conditions that inhibited us from receiving that funds. But one of the things now that we have as a problem that I was hoping you would address, or your staff, I could talk with them about, is that currently there are only 3 HUD staffers serving the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, at least in terms of community planning and development programs. That's for over $22 billion. And the islands do not have the type of support I believe necessary to process payments in timely manner. In addition, for the Virgin Islands, anything over $5 million has to go to HUD, and it takes them weeks in order to review the pay packages. Are there any provisions included in this budget that could help, say, raise HUD staffing levels, including for the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, related to the implementation of CDBG DR funding?
Absolutely, and I'm so very, very pleased that you asked that question. You know, in recent years, we've seen about a 33% reduction in staff for our financial, fiscal, and program integrity functions. Those are the people that would be staffing, 33%. That is why this budget is requesting a significant increase in staffing. If we are not put in a position to carry out the mission in a way that is urgent, efficient, we are always going to be behind the 8 ball. I've got great staff. Don't get me wrong, the staff we have is outstanding, but they can only do so much. And so if we build our capacity within the agency to do the kinds of things that you are talking about, we will be a much better agency. So that is why we've made this request. But also do know that at some point in the last couple of years, we reached our very lowest, 6,000 employees. At one point, HUD had 20,000 employees. So you can imagine what is happening, and I say again, at one point, HUD was 7% of the federal discretionary budget. Today, it is less than 1%.
Well, thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, as someone who grew up in public housing and understand its importance to allow families like my own parents to be able to save to then purchase a home, which was then used to leverage to allow me to go to school, I appreciate the support that this administration is giving to providing not a safety net, but a means to bounce up in this country. Thank you very much.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Fudge, thank you for being here. I'm new, so we never got a chance to serve together, but congratulations on the appointment. And let's just go ahead and get to it. A couple things before I get into question. I know that in committee we were discussing some of the potential inflationary impacts going on in the housing market. I do think it's important for us to understand that, you know, when HUD, frankly, no matter what administration is in charge, enters into the marketplace for greening projects or even for construction projects, they are actually purchasing stock of material that's already scarce in the going marketplace. So one of my concerns is that the purchasing activity of HUD under the budget recommendation is actually going to exacerbate our inflationary problems when it comes to housing, which is going to have a direct corollary impact on the actual price of housing in a lot of communities. Because if you don't have as much lumber available, concrete available, windows available, et cetera, because the federal government is using its purchasing power to engage and gobble up these supplies faster than GCs on the ground can gobble them up, that creates a real issue for the market overall. Second issue I would add is, and this is, I would say this is probably not under your direct purview, being the Secretary of HUD, but our immigration enforcement policies right now are not helping the matter. Because if the numbers are correct, that we're taking in about 700,000 people into the United States illegally over this year already, I mean, where are they gonna go? We already know we have a affordable housing shortfall, but if we're bringing people into the country illegally and there's already a housing shortfall, that only further exacerbates the housing issues we're seeing across the United States. So I would think that not so much your purview, but the administration has to take a long look at this, because if you try to bring these two things together, that policy does not help, frankly, homeless Americans and other Americans trying to find affordable housing here in the United States. If you bring more people into the United States, I mean, there's only but so much housing available. Bringing more people in while not being able to have the ability to expand the stock because of inflationary pressures and other things like that is not going to help Americans in the long run. But I do want to focus on the part of the budget that deals with exclusionary zoning, local zoning. I see that the administration has dollars committed to that, but the budget request doesn't really provide much detail. Can you expand upon a detail of how this grant program is going to work dealing with exclusionary zoning issues and on a local level?
Well, as I was explaining earlier, what we are doing is we are asking communities to look at their zoning. I was the mayor of a city, I had zoning that had been there 100 years. And some of that zoning, because we never had looked at it, was creating barriers to and/or increasing the cost of building, whether it be housing or businesses or whatever. So what we're saying to them is, let's have a conversation about the zoning that may in fact be prohibiting not only new housing and new businesses, but keeping people who, under normal circumstances, that could afford to purchase a home in your community or build a home in your community. Let's help them do that, to move to communities of opportunity. And so that is what it's about. It's not dictating, it's not mandating. It is saying, let's put the resources in place to have people actually take a look. So maybe it's the Planning Commission, maybe it's a group of people, a citizens group, but we are putting resources to assist them and taking a look at their zoning. That's basically all it is.
So Madam Secretary, and I understand the conversations that exist. I was a state legislator before I came here. Okay. I would have conversations with our local county commission, because what would happen is you would get county commissioners and people in the affordable housing space would say, the state needs to put more dollars into affordable housing. And I would look right back in, I'm gonna say, if you're gonna really deal with affordable housing issues, you have to deal with the unit per acre, and the only entity politically that deals with that are local county commissions and city councils. They have to look at their zoning rules. But I just want to, hearing on what you're saying, can you commit to the committee that the proposal is not going to force local governments into a zoning parameter, that these dollars in the budget are really just a foster conversation? Is that?
And there's no way we can force them to do it.
All right, I just want to make sure that we're not, because my concern is that frankly it's not the role of any federal agency or our government writ large to put mandated pressure on local governments associated with zoning. That's something local governments need to figure out for themselves with their citizens and what works best for each one of their individual communities.
I agree with you 100%. Remember, I was the mayor of a city. I would never let someone come in and tell me how to zone my city. And that's what I was saying to some of your colleagues earlier. We should not be mandating what communities and people do with their lives and with their communities. And I agree. I'm sorry I didn't get to serve with you.
That's all right. Listen, thank you so much, Madam Secretary, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Gentlemen's time has expired. We're going to take just a minute or two break. We think we may have a technical problem that we're trying to resolve. So if we can relax for just a minute or two. Take a break. Why don't we just say 5 minutes, and if anybody needs to take a break, we can do that.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
I can now. I couldn't before, so I tried to look up there. They weren't on this screen at all. Okay, well, okay, that's fine. Yeah, I couldn't before. Okay.
The committee will come to order and is now back in session. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Sexton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thought that oops, get that back on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thought that the issue that you all were experiencing was that the clock had disappeared from our view here. So I don't actually have a clock, but I'm going to go ahead and set a 5-minute timer in any event. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Fudge, for joining us. This is actually the second time I've had the pleasure of hearing from you. You came before us in April in the subcommittee on transportation and housing of appropriations, and it's wonderful to see you again and to see this great budget that you have put together. Now, before I start with my questions, I do want to take a moment to thank you for 2 actions that were recently taken by HUD that will go a long way towards preventing discrimination against vulnerable people in housing. When we spoke back in April, I asked you about the timeline for rescinding the Preserving Community and Neighborhood Choice Rule from the previous administration. As you may recall, this rule threatened Fair Housing Act protections for millions of people with disabilities and many others, and I'm very glad to see that HUD issued an interim final rule that will go into effect at the end of next month to rescind it. So thank you very much for that. And thank you also for withdrawing the rule proposed by the previous administration that would have weakened the equal access rule and prevented transgender people from accessing emergency shelter and housing. As you know, that community is under attack, experiences homelessness and crises at a much higher rate than the regular population. And we're very, very vulnerable because of the repeal of the equal access rule. So I want to thank you so much for doing that. Now turning now to President Biden's budget request, I was very glad to see that the budget included strong increased funding for Section 811 supportive housing for persons with disabilities program. Can you talk about how this program will help more individuals with disabilities find housing and continue to live independently?
Thank you very much. The 811 program has been increased. We've increased funding for the 811 program and the 202 senior program. what we are finding is that persons who are disabled are having as much difficulty as almost any other population finding a place to live. And so when we put the resources in to build new housing, as well as to provide vouchers for those to put them in other facilities other than our standard public housing facilities, I think that it is going to be a significant change in how we make sure that we are addressing that population. There's about $270 million to address this issue in and of itself. So we're very, very happy about the direction that the president wants us to go, and it is more than a $40 million increase over our last budget.
Thank you so much. And we have a great need for help for our disabled community in my district, and I think in every congressional district. So this will really go a long way to help. Your budget also includes a large increase in funding for technical assistance at the Office of Policy Development and Research. And you touched on this a little bit, I think, with Representative Plaskett. In April, we talked about how this technical assistance could help providers who are working to address the needs of transgender people and older LGBTQ adults, as well as other, historically marginalized communities. Can you talk about how this or any other HUD program can help these marginalized communities?
You broke up at the end. You asked me
how this increase in technical assistance will help traditionally marginalized communities get more access to HUD programs.
One of the things about our development and research arm, we have been taking a look at the effects. And so we are putting more money into that to be sure that we are taking a look in its totality at how we can better address these communities. So I think it's going to be a significant improvement in how HUD approaches communities, especially communities, transgender communities and others. I do say that HUD was one of the very first to recognize the problem and address the problem. So we are really on top of it, probably more than just about any other agency in the federal government.
Thank you very much. And just, I do want to touch on something else that you talked a little bit about today. HUD staffing, it declined 22% during the time from 2010 to 2019. Can you describe the impact of reduced capacity at HUD that it has on grant review, monitoring, oversight, and overall program administration, and how will President Biden's proposed budget help address these issues?
Well, one of the things that happens is that HUD does get tasked with doing an awful lot of things, but they don't increase our staff. So we get new funding, we get new programming, but we don't get more staff. And so it just continues to make the problem worse. So they sometimes will give us temporary housing, but those programs go on for years and years. So we don't just need the staffing for a short period of time. We need staffing to go throughout at least those programs, which could go 5 years or 10 years. So we need permanent staff. And I think that when you start to take a look at the resources that come through HUD and the amount of people there, the corollary is just so off that any person should be able to look at what we receive and the number of our staff and know that we are having some challenges doing the kind of work we need to do.
Great, thank you so much. I see my time has expired, so I'll yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, for 5 minutes. Apparently he's given up. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Very vital and important hearing, and thank you to Madam Secretary for hitting the ground running and certainly being so effective by understanding the co-equal branches of government and the way in which we can work together as Congress and executive. So welcome again.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman, thank you, and thank the ranking member. Let me start. As you well know, we have a short period of time in these sessions, so I thank you for your answers. But let me, because of my frustration, let me have you just clarify again of the administration's commitment to homeless persons, which in a city like Houston and Harris County, we are working, but we are also struggling. In terms of funding for homeless vets, which, as you indicated, the distribution and selection goes to the veterans, but to be very clear that there is no reality to the zeroing out, that there are funding, that you're collaborating with funding for homeless persons and also for homeless vets, which is a great need in Houston, and I want to be able to work with you on that. But Madam Secretary, would you just comment on that, please?
Yes, thank you for allowing me to make the clarification again. We currently have 22,000 unused veterans vouchers. The vouchers that are in the system now are continuing. And overall, the budget increases vouchers by 200,000 vouchers, which would include new vouchers for veterans. So there is plenty of vouchers available for veterans.
What about homeless funding for persons homeless on the street, families, children that are in our communities?
Yes, if you remember, Congress did give us $5 billion to address those. Well, actually, a total of 10, $5 billion for vouchers and $5 billion to actually put them in housing, as well as this budget asked for an increase as well.
So the administration is on record for recognizing the crisis of homelessness in America and addressing it by increasing their fiscal budget for this time frame. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Let me put in a pitch for Houston in terms of work that we are doing, and we'll need to get with you on those fundings as we move through the process. Thank you. As you well know, our community in Houston, Harris County has suffered enormous devastation from Hurricane Harvey. In the Balanced Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, we were given fundings dealing with community development block grant mitigation. In fact, we were given about $4 billion. Unfortunately, we are still, because of inadequate response by the GLO and that's the Government Land Office, which governs this in the state of Texas, that we are still in the process of distribution. Let me ask you, and I asked to submit this letter into the record June 17, 2021, sent to HUD, Madam Secretary, is that the GLO got $1 billion. Houston, Harris County each got zero. They're two separate entities, the fourth largest city and the fifth largest county. Would you be able to look into the fact that the GLO wants to give to to Harris County $700 million and zero to Houston, which is without justification in light of us having over 50% of the damage of Hurricane Harvey?
If I may, Ms. Jackson Lee, the state of Texas received a total of $4.2 billion from
Absolutely.
the CDBG MIT. And so let me just be clear, and I'm going to read it just so I say it correctly. Texas cannot draw or distribute funds for the municipalities designated in this competition unless and until their substantial action plan amendment is approved by HUD. We have not approved a plan. A plan has not been submitted to us. And so until such time as they do that, not only do they need to submit a plan, but further, they need to have input from the community. Neither of those things have happened, and they are not at this point allowed to do anything, to distribute it to anyone. And so we don't know what the plan is we're going to receive from them, but once we get it, we will make sure that they are in compliance, because the plan further requires that they look at communities of need as well.
Thank you so very much, and it will provide our input. Let me just quickly say this. One of the issues in my community, I know the stance on public building new construction, but dealing with those in public housing now, the maintenance, the additional resources for additional enhancement program, job training, and others. You have been committed to that in terms of development in our inner cities. Can you tell me the kind of funding or emphasis will be on existing public housing and to improve the quality, as well as the opportunity for potentially returning felons, which we've made the request, who've done their time to be able to come home to their families?
Well, in the American Jobs Plan, the president asked for $40 billion. We're asking for another $3 billion in this budget. We know that that is not probably going to be enough to take care of all of the problems, but what we do know is that it is a significant investment, one that has not been made in those numbers in a very, very long time, as well as we expect for those funds to be leveraged so that they can be used through the Section 8 program or the RAD program. So we do believe that it will make a significant improvement in existing public housing.
It's very important.
Gentleman's
I
time has
will,
expired.
I
Now
will continue
recognize,
this discussion, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And Madam Secretary, we invite you to Houston. Thank you so very much. I yield back.
Thank you.
gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Series, for 5 minutes.
Madam Secretary, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. It's nice to see you, Mr. Series.
Nice to see you. First of all, congratulations on your confirmation.
Thank you.
If anyone is the right person for this job, it's you. Because certainly someone has been dealing with public housing as a mayor, knows exactly what the problems are. We saw that they need a brain surgeon for this job. I just want to say also that I thank you for coming to Hoboken recently for the Rebuild by Design project in Hoboken, New Jersey. This project will build infrastructure resilient to the kind of floodings that we have with Superstorm Sandy. So I thank you for being there. It meant a lot to the people in my district that you were there.
Thank you.
Also, I have a couple of questions, but more for my own information. When I was mayor, we had a lot of housing stock that was built after the war for the veterans coming back. And I remember having trouble using funds from the West New York Housing Authority to fix those apartments that were built for the veterans. Do you know if that's still the case? Maybe if Steph can look into it.
You know what, Mr. Sears, let me see if I can find out. I don't know, but I will find out and get you an answer as quickly as I can.
Okay, great. The other thing is, I also dealt a lot with HMFA. We had two particular programs that I think are very good. One is the Right to Own program that we had in New Jersey. Basically, people would be able to buy, they would have to live in the place for 15 years before they could buy it. But what it turned out to be was a very small community where everybody took care of the property, everybody took care of their particular home, and they were very, very happy to have a place called of their own, even if they couldn't sell it, after 15 years. The other program that we will use, especially to build for senior building, was the tax credit program. At a time where dollars are short, I think these programs were so beneficial because we were able to build these kind of programs in my community. So I would just urge you to continue funding these programs because I just feel that this is the way to go. And the other thing is, I am very happy with the American Jobs Plan because it will produce money to retrofit almost 2 million affordable housing units. As we all know, these affordable housing units have aged. And aging is very expensive to retrofit these units. So, I think that is a wise use of the money. So if you could just help me out with those.
I'd be happy to. As a matter of fact, we are expanding the resources that are available to the low-income housing tax credit, as well as in the President's Jobs Plan. There's going to be an expansion because there's going to be a new tax credit. So we are on the same page and thinking the same way.
Great. And in terms of the program of Right to Own?
I'm sorry?
And in terms of a program where the person—
Oh, the right to own, the right to own. Let me
Yes.
look into that. I mean, I think it's a great idea. Let me look into it and see, the right to own. Okay, we'll check it and get back with you.
Well, you can always come back to the district. I'll take you around.
Thank you for the invitation.
All right, I really don't have much else to say, but just congratulate, and I'm so happy that we're finally focused on the need that is so needed in this country. And before I forget, 70,000 people came across, and they're not legal. That make it sound like 70,000 people are going to get apartments and give it away from the American people. Actually, they're not eligible to have any units, right?
Correct.
If you're here illegally.
You are correct. They are not eligible.
Good. Thank you. I don't need much more time.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith. Secretary Fudge, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Housing shortages have locked many families out of homes across the country, especially first-time buyers. My district is facing these same housing shortages, but because I represent a rural district, housing development can be more complicated. Rural areas lack the infrastructure urban areas have and can't quickly produce tract housing with 25 starter homes without a significant investment from local resources to make sure that they have electricity, water infrastructure, broadband, and so forth. So the community block grant, communities in my district rely on the community block grants as a flexible source of funding to complete some of these projects. The congressional justification also includes $295 million increase on the revitalization of deteriorating or deteriorated neighborhoods and places with the greatest need. These funds are separate from the old formula used to calculate the usual allotment of these resources. The justification says that the allotment of these dollars would be at your discretion. Madam Secretary, how much of the $295 million CDBG dollar increase will be utilized in the rural parts of our country?
Well, I think if you take into consideration that about 14% of all of the dollars we use for public housing, et cetera, it goes to rural communities, I would think that we would look at how much really goes. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but we know that it is significant because we know that a significant number of people who live in rural communities are already receiving HUD resources. So the one thing that I say to people who ask me about rural, HUD is not a rural or urban area particularly. HUD takes care of all people who need housing. And certainly the rural communities, I believe, in the past have not been always given the resources that they deserve. And I'm certainly willing to take a look at how we can make sure that that doesn't continue to happen.
Yeah. Thank you, Secretary Fudge. I greatly appreciate that because we really struggle in rural America, you know, as our communities continue to reduce in population and stuff like that. And the infrastructure costs are just so significant that we need all the assistance that we can get. One other note on the subject of rural broadband, HUD's congressional justification notes that the public housing program and the Office of Multifamily Housing will focus on providing broadband to families of underserved communities. Broadband access is a major priority for me and my rural district in Iowa. Will these initiatives provide any focus toward rural America? If so, how? And I know what you said earlier, but I'd just like you to, if you could relate this now to broadband, I'd greatly appreciate it.
You know, the language of the bill actually directs a lot of it to rural and underserved communities. One of the things that I knew even from my days on ag is that one of the things that farmers talked about was broadband. One of the things that people in rural communities talk about is broadband. So know that we are going to spend a significant amount, probably more, in rural communities as a percentage, as a percentage of the total, because rural communities have less access. So there are two main populations that don't have broadband, rural and inner cities. And so the bulk of the resources are going to go to those two places.
Well, Secretary Fudge, I really appreciate that. You know, you think of rural America, and this is where the struggle again becomes, especially when we talk about education, online education. We really struggled through the pandemic. And then also telehealth. You know, a lot of people are traveling 30 to 40 miles to a hospital right now, and broadband can be the difference maker when we create telehealth. So I urge you to look at this. I think it's such a critical asset for rural communities. With that, thank you for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you. And I would say that we are not going to continue to allow kids to have to go and sit in the parking lot of a McDonald's or at the library. We are really going to do everything we can to be sure that communities that you're addressing have the kind of broadband that they need.
I'm so grateful for those comments. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, I'm thrilled to see you before the committee today. And while you are missed in the House chamber, I could not think of a better person to serve as secretary and fight for housing security and economic equity for all Americans. So thank you so much.
Thank you, my
I
friend. It's
also-
nice to see you.
It's good to see you too. I also applaud the budget request before the committee today for its significant investment in affordable housing and specific housing assistance to historically underfunded and marginalized communities. Madam Secretary, as you know, we live in an era when rent is skyrocketing, housing is increasingly scarce, more families are having to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table. So much of this is about access to housing and then access to jobs from that housing, which is why I'm such a strong supporter of transit-oriented development, a model of mixed-use development, housing, retail, commercial building, located within a half-mile radius of transit. And this doesn't have to be forced. You have good transit, and businesses, retails, they like to locate there, and you get good housing options. So, Madam Secretary, do you agree that transit-oriented development could drastically increase the supply of affordable housing, both around transit stations, but also in the areas that to which transit provides access?
I agree 100%. And Secretary Buttigieg and I are working together to be sure that the jobs plan and our budgets reflect that sentiment exactly.
What else can we do to work alongside HUD and DOT to make these kinds of investments and to support your work?
Well, I think that one of the things that can be done is to start is for Congress to start to look at the budgets as a collective, and not just look at a HUD budget and look at a transportation budget separately, but to look at them together, because I think then you will find that when we work together, we do accomplish the things that you're talking about. I can't put it in mine, but he can in his, so that's why we're working together. We're going to be doing some things publicly as well, and it would be great if you all could just make sure that you are supportive and that you are there when we come to your communities to talk about the very things that we know our communities need. If we're talking about building new housing, we have to get people to work. If we're talking about building new businesses, we have to get people to work. We know that transportation is tied significantly to what we're doing with housing as well.
Well, one of the things that often prevents transit-oriented development in places where the free market would bring it without even any incentives is zoning practices. And zoning practices coupled with restrictive covenants, a history of unethical mortgage and real estate practices have often left racially and socially economically segregated communities in their wake. So affordable housing, of course, aims to address this challenge, but there are a lot of challenges that persist, and often families who get access to affordable housing don't get access to the highest performing schools, the best performing jobs, and other community resources that are so important. So I know you all, you know all too well that housing determines whether many resources and opportunities are accessible. How does the FY22 HUD budget request promote smart growth zoning ordinances?
Well, one of the things, and you said the word zoning, one of the things we're doing is giving incentives to communities to look at their zoning. The one thing that I know from my many years of being an elected official and just from being a community person, all people want the same thing. Every single person wants to live in a decent home, to live someplace that's safe, to have their children have good education, to be able to take care of their parents and grandparents. Every single person, whether you're rich or poor, wants the same thing. But our societies have become so separated and segregated that in one community that I used to represent, if you drove 9 miles, their life expectancy was 10 years more. So we can't continue to allow zip codes to dictate our outcomes. And I think that all of us throughout government are looking at everything through an equity lens. And I believe that when you get a chance to look at the total president's budget, I think you'll be pleased.
Well, keep us informed of how we can further support your work. We're so fortunate to have your leadership. So thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Now you're stuck with me for the 10 minutes, so I yield myself those 10 minutes. And to begin, I want to echo what Mr. Moulton has said. I can't imagine a person who not only has the background to do this job so well and successfully, but also the passion for the mission of the agency, and that's what sometimes we haven't seen in recent years. You know, I said to you before the hearing that one of the things that impressed me most about the Biden administration and their proposals, and this would certainly be true of the HUD budget proposal as well, is that we've essentially changed the mindset of the last 56 or 60 years about how the federal government deals with the challenges of the country. We've been saying, the first question we've always asked is, what can we afford to do? And now the question we're asking, which I think is the appropriate question first, is what do the American people need us to do? And I think, again, your budget proposal and the entire Biden agenda reflect that mindset. In my district, we have a neighborhood of low-income housing. It's virtually 100% people of color. And in the middle of it, we have something called the Keystone Academy. The Keystone Academy is an early childhood education center. It stays open all day. It provides not only incredible education for the kids from that neighborhood, but also childcare, which is essential for those families. And when I visited there and saw not only the miracles they work there with the kids, but also thinking about how pieces fit together in a lot of different ways. And while your focus is on housing, we really are focused on broader pictures. We're focused on communities, neighborhoods, communities, cities, and obviously our country. And it seems to me that we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'd like you to kind of elaborate on how the pieces of the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan fit together, both to help you advance the mission of your department, but also just the country.
You know, Mr. Yarmouth, Mr. Chairman, I have been in elective office almost 30 years. I have never been more happy to be where I am today. The Biden administration has become so visionary. These budgets talk about how we live, not what we do, but how we live. Coming out of COVID, you just can't imagine the number of people who can't afford childcare, who maybe aren't back to their jobs, who are now forced to take care of their families. And I say it this way. When we went into the COVID protocols, the first thing they said to us, Mr. Chairman, is stay home. What happened if you didn't have a home? They said to us that we need to educate our children virtually. So you don't have a home and then you don't have high-speed internet or you don't have broadband. They said if you're sick, stay home, heal at home. And so when people say to us that, well, housing is not infrastructure, how could it not be? When they say to us that it is not important for us to do things like create a care economy, when we have a system today where there are not enough places for people who are elderly to go, our senior care is really not anywhere where it needs to be. So we're saying we need to build more senior housing. The other thing we need to do is help people who are getting older but are healthy age in place. Our societies have never talked about those things. We need to talk about how we better educate our children. We talk about it, but we don't put the resources or we don't put the heft behind it that needs to be there. And so I would say that the jobs plan, the families plan, and of course the rescue plan that was already passed is looking at an America that is really going to be able to compete and lead the rest of the world. If we continue to think about infrastructure and we continue to think about how we treat our families the way we did 20 years ago, we will forever be lost. We are already being surpassed by so many countries because we have not invested in research and technology. We have not invested in our education systems to the way we should, and we have clearly not made it comfortable for people to live and work in this country. And that is what this budget does. It looks at how people live and not just what they think people need.
And it also strikes me that there is something that kind of permeates the entire Biden agenda, and that is a sense of urgency. And I think too often because they're tough challenges that we face in so many areas, whether it's housing, education, healthcare, there's a tendency to kick the can down the road and not deal with things when they can be dealt with maybe less expensively and more efficiently. And sometimes I see, and not necessarily in Congress right now, but I see some of my Republican colleagues around the country think that it's more urgent to keep schools from teaching critical race theory, which they don't teach, than it is to deal with the things that really matter in people's lives. And one of the things that you mentioned early on in your testimony, the issue of disinvestment. And certainly that's true of our housing stock. It's true of, again, you just mentioned a number of areas in which we have disinvested, and part of that was because of our austerity attitude, starting back in 2011 and the sequestration program. So I know to some people, a 15% increase seems like a pretty hefty increase in 1 year, but when you've talked about the cutback in staff and all the things, so this really probably, if you think about if you were running a business organization, you wouldn't have needed a 15% increase this year because you would have made the investments all along. Is that the case?
You know, I would say this, Mr. Chairman. I think that we have so long looked at numbers and not what the numbers mean. At some point, we do have to bite the bullet. Great nations do great things, and this is a great nation. And until we make the kinds of commitments and put the resources behind it, we are not ever going to be what we ought to be. At some point, you just have to say, this is the time. I don't know that there is a better time. We have an administration that is willing to do big and bold things. We have a Congress full of brilliant people, and we have people in this country who have hope. This is the time for us to make the changes that need to be made. And if we don't do it, then we talk a good game, but when you really want to do something, you find a way to do it. You find the resources. We find the resources to do all kinds of other things. Let's find the resources to invest in our people and the future of this nation.
I totally agree. And we asked the right question first. What do we need to do? I think the Biden administration has answered that. Now we've figured out how to resource it.
That's right.
We can do that. We can do that. I'm going to let you go. I just want to make one point, just because this is something I follow as kind of a pet project, because we talked about inflation and lumber prices. Lumber prices are now down almost 50% in the last month. And as a matter of fact, I just checked a little while ago, and they're down almost 11 or 12% today. Right. So what's happened is, and this is why I think this discussion of this panicking over inflation right now is uninformed and misguided. And that is what happened with the lumber prices. A lot of the lumber producers thought when the pandemic started, there wouldn't be a demand, so they cut back. Then the developers started buying up all the stock in the futures, driving the prices up. Now they're having to sell that back, all of those things they bought, because they misjudged the dynamics of the market. So, that's happening with rental cars. It's happening with a lot of other things right now. So, again, all this goes to the point of we can afford to do what we need to do on behalf of the American people. So once again, let me thank you for your testimony, the time you spent with us, your responsiveness, and the great job you're doing. And unless there is any further business, the hearing stands adjourned.
Thank you very, very much. Mr. Ranking Member?